Hey, welcome to Into the Ultra. I'm Brian Stillman, and I'm here with Tony DiTerlizzi, who's not just an artist, he's a friend. He's a friend. Gets
An
right
owl bear friend.
An owlbear friend, right. It's bonding over owlbears, bonding over the mistakes of wizards. But Tony, D&D artist, magic artist, children's book artist, and writer. The list goes on and on. Owlbear aficionado. Dungeons and Dragons is where I first sort of encountered your stuff. How did you first get involved with gaming? Because you've always been a gamer.
Always been a gamer since the game came out in, the early, well, for me, probably the early 80s. I remember, and I was completely obsessed by 1982, which is probably when most of that generation was obsessed with Dungeons and Dragons. And it was really sweeping the country. And then I played it, and it kind of had a run through the 80s. And by the time I was, out of high school, no one was really playing it any longer that I was aware of. And then I went to art school and down in South Florida. I grew up in South Florida. And when I came out of art school, I had high aspirations to be, a children's book illustrator. I didn't even think I could be a writer at that point. And possibly an editorial illustrator for magazines, because remember in the late 80s and the early 1990s, all the magazines, Playboy, Esquire, Rolling Stone, Entertainment Weekly, they all used tons of illustration. And that was a real high profile gig if you could get it. And so really the last thing on my mind was doing art for Dungeons and Dragons. It was not at all in my thinking. My portfolio may have had some fantasy creatures in it when I graduated art school, but it certainly was not, bent towards trying to get work in the fantasy illustration field.
Why not? Why wasn't that something you were thinking about? Because I grew up reading comic books, and I was like, one day I'm going to write comic books, you know what I mean, or whatever. Why was that not on your radar?
So I just didn't think that I didn't think I could do it. That's the honest answer. It's funny, I had no problem sending my stuff to Rolling Stone magazine to try to get a job there, or to Esquire or Playboy, whatever, all the big I had no problem sending. I had no problem sending my horrible stories and illustrations to all the big publishers.
But TSR, oh man, forget that.
I can't do that. I'm not good enough. It was literally, I'm not good enough. I don't think I'm good enough to do it. It had such a special place in my heart.
Right. These things that we love, on one hand, we feel encouraged. That's where we want to be. But there's this kind of double-edged sword, because they're the ones that frighten us the most.
Yeah.
So what changed? What eventually got you to finally submit? Because you submitted. So you submitted to Peggy Cooper, right?
Yeah.
So Peggy Cooper was like an art director. Or pre-art director at TSR, and you finally did send some stuff to her. What changed for you? Why'd you do that?
Well, I did, after art school, because I couldn't get work, I moved back home. I mean, I was living with my parents, and I reconnected with some old friends, met some new friends, and we started having this conversation about things we loved as a kid, and Dungeons and Dragons came up. And everybody got so excited. Everybody. So we all started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and and so for most of us, there had been a huge gap from being a tweeny young teenager playing to now, literally just in 10 years, you're in your early 20s, and it was a whole different game.
Right.
And I have a very obsessive nature. When I'm into something, I get 100% into it, and I was back in Dungeons and Dragons. And the thing that actually, now that I think about it, Brian, that really changed it for me was I had the core 3 books. So the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual. Everyone knows those books. Those are the books I'd grown up with. For some reason, I couldn't find the Monster Manual in my closet of crap from when I was a kid. So I went to a Walden Books,
of course,
to go get a new one, and it didn't exist. That version, that old hardcover version, had been replaced by the big 3-ring,
the Monstrous Compendium
version. Yes. So I think the idea that the Monster Manual, and then for that matter, all the core books, had been re-illustrated at that point. gave me hope that I might be able to do it, because I had assumed that the original books were just still in print and those were the books.
That was it. The game
You know
was
what
the
I mean?
game, and it wasn't going to shift at all.
Yeah. So, and even my early submissions were just modules. I mocked up page spreads of current modules, and just, I had laser copied my drawings and like cut them out and taped them into the spreads of the module and sent those to them. And so that's the work I thought I'd get, would be module work.
What kind of response did you get from Peggy early on? Like initially, so you send that stuff in, you finally built yourself up to the point where you're comfortable doing this. Yeah. You send it in, what happened?
Well, I sent it all in, and I got maybe a month or so later, I get a form rejection letter.
Oh.
That's just very like, thanks for your submission. We'll keep your stuff on file. And then Peggy had I wish I had the letter for the life of me, and it may be here somewhere, unbeknownst to me.
Right.
But Peggy had written a thing to the effect of, nice monsters or something like that, and that was it. And so I was, on one hand I was like, self-fulfilling. I knew I couldn't get work there.
Right.
But then on the other hand, I'm like, but they really liked my work. And the fact that she had given me a little extra was different than the form rejection letters I had received from publishers and magazines, where I had sent these very elaborate portfolios to try to get work. And so I called her, which, was kind of a funny thing. I called her and it would like ring and then I would hang up. Like I was so scared at the idea. Again, I did this 3 times and I didn't leave a message. And then I called at like 5 o'clock and I caught her.
Wow.
And we had a chat, and she, I can't do the Midwestern accent, but she was so not what I had thought of, these like New York, really cut and dry, savvy art directors. She hi, yeah, yeah, like that. And and I get Peggy Cooper, and she's like, oh, hi, Tony, how are you?
She is
so nice to hear from
I've
you.
Met
like
Peggy, and she is the nicest human being on the planet.
She's
like a walking smile.
Yes, I could smell the cupcakes cooking in her. You know what I mean? Like, she had like an apron on. You want a cupcake?
Right. Peggy is awesome.
So amazing. So I asked her, I kind of stammered out like, I'm so sorry to bother you. And, and I sent the art and you said, it was a rejection letter, but then you said you liked it and I don't know what to do. Well, she's like, it was so like, you silly. She's like, all you did was draw a bunch of monsters standing around. They're not doing anything. You got to make them, fighting and adventurers fighting the monsters and finding treasure and daring do. That was literally daring do and all that stuff. That is burned into my memory banks. Daring do and all that sort of stuff. Do you think you can do that? And I'm like, yeah, I'll have something for you in like a couple weeks. Okay, I got to go now. The cupcakes are burning. Bye. The irony is, I mean, she gave me a huge box set. I did Dragon Mountain.
Yep.
Which was a ginormous, it was not what I expected at all. Like I literally thought, okay, here's a module and you're going to do, 10 drawings.
So the first thing she gave you was Dragon Mountain?
Dragon Mountain.
That's crazy. Dragon Mountain, and it has that great cover by Janelle Jaques, that sort of classic D&D dragon looming. I mean, it's a classic box set, and this thing is landing in your lap. That's a lot of drawings for a first assignment.
It's a lot of lousy drawings when I look back at it now. There's not a lot of great art in it. I was in way over my head. I had no idea. It was beyond my bandwidth at the time. I mean, I drew the art for that at my mom's kitchen table and in my bedroom, my old that I shared now with my brother. It was in high school at that point.
Right.
So I was super excited, but very scared, not confident, and just wanted to do a good job. I just wanted to do a good enough job that they would be happy and give me more work. And they did. The irony is, then I got the Monstrous Manual, and all that was a bunch of monsters standing around doing nothing with no backgrounds.
How did it feel? Like, okay, this thing that you thought was out of your reach, this thing that you loved, you're doing it. You're doing
Yeah.
D&D at this point. How did that feel?
I've had this feeling multiple times in my life, Brian. It felt like someone was going to take it away.
Hmm.
It felt like it wasn't going to last and I wasn't good enough. It happened. I felt the same thing when I first got my first children's book published, and I felt it when the Spiderwick Chronicles became very popular. I felt it's going to like go away. They've found something out, and there's something wrong. You know, you not. It's not selling. You're not doing something right, and we're moving on to a different person. It's just insecurity, you know. But that's how it felt. I thought, I'm going to do this one Dragon Mountain thing and I'll do my best. And that's all I can do, but I'm somehow going to, I'm going to blow it. Peggy's going to get fired, you know, whatever. Something's going to happen and then it's all going to go away. And instead, Tim Beach calls me and says, I'm doing the first color version of the Monster Manual and I want you to illustrate the entire book.
Was there any room in that fear for excitement? For a sort of awareness of, holy crap, I'm doing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But it didn't, my memory is that on Dragon Mountain, it was more fear than enjoyment. But on the Monstrous Manual, it was pure joy.
Okay. Was it strange to get that peek behind the curtain? Was it weird to kind of be on that side of things? Did that affect the way you like your feelings about the game?
I loved being there. I loved going up to TSR and at Lake Geneva. I went there a few times early on. I would fly back and forth and meet with them. I made great friends, people I'm still friends with to this day.
Was Lake Geneva like a magical, like I used to see Lake Geneva, Wisconsin on all the books, and I just had this dream in my head that it was like, I don't know. I figured there had to be at least one castle there or something. It was like fantasy. It was like Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Like I don't know. That meant something to me back in the day.
Well, that and Gen Con. Like I had no idea what Gen Con was. I mean, I remember seeing it in the back of magazines and even in some of the books. I want to say they would say, "Come to Gen Con."
Yeah, they had the like order forms in the back of some of the books and modules.
Yeah,
and stuff.
big blocky letters.
Yeah.
And the first time I went up, I stayed at Tim's apartment with him, and he drove me around. And I remember him taking me to, Gygax's old house and where the original TSR and pointing it out. And you're like, it's just an old house. Like that's it. That's it. Where they were, it made sense because it was like this. It looked almost like an old shipping facility.
Right. That was the third headquarters, the long kind of brick building up on that kind of hill. With that crazy tunnel connecting the two parts of it.
Yes, that was yes, I remember that too. Yeah.
So how did all this morph into Planescape? Because Planescape that shifted everything for a lot of people. A lot of people, that's the thing they go back to when they think about the D&D stuff they loved, or the D&D stuff that made their eyes bug out. I know for me, flipping through Planescape, whether it was the writing, like Colin and Zev and all them, or the art, is just like, this is completely different.
There was a couple of things happening at the same time. So the first thing was that, Tim asked me to do the Monstrous Manual, and he and I had a conversation, and we agreed that it was best that I don't do the entire book. There was like 300 illustrations, and my concern was the art would suffer the way it did in Dragon Mountain when I was in. It was too much for me to handle. So we agreed on, I think he was like, okay, so I'm going to give you 100 monsters to do instead.
Make it easy.
I was like, okay. So great payday. And then, able to draw all these amazing monsters. Right. So I think there's a couple pieces to this. So what happened was I had this sketchbook up to that point that had everything I had done for my submission and on. Like I was obsessed. So I was drawing this stuff even when it wasn't part of work now. I was just drawing it all the time, thinking about it and all that kind of stuff. And this sketchbook was almost full of just, it would be the thing like if we were at a restaurant eating and we start talking about, well, what if a mind flayer, it looked more like a cuttlefish than an octopus? You draw that, you should draw that. Oh man, you got to save that, man. That's the thing, right? You know, like there was all kinds of crap like that where we would go out and, you know, we get going and worked up and talk about it. And I would draw it and then be like, oh, I got to save this. And I would tape it in my book. And then later I would draw a nicer version of it in my sketchbook. And over the course of, at this point now, a year, right? Because I graduated early in 92. So now we're in early 93 when Tim asked me to work on the Monster Manual. And so I, you know, he's like, well, do you, you know, I've seen the stuff you did in Dragon Mountain. Is there other monsters that, you know, that you've done sketches of? And I said, I'm going to send you a package tomorrow. So I put my sketchbooks in a FedEx box and just FedExed it to him, which I would never do now, right? Like,
I was going to say,
so reckless.
Hurl those out into the void.
Just reckless. No, there's no copies of it, nothing. I just literally, and I think I, you know, shove some brown paper, put it in brown paper, seal it, literally drop it in a bin, you know.
Right.
So he calls me like the next day and goes, so I got your sketchbook. And that's when he was like, I want you to do the whole Monster Manual. But I think what he saw was the way I thought, and that I was thinking differently than a lot of the other illustrators that they were working with, the pool of illustrators that they were tapping. He could see that I was looking at Rankin and Bass and Brian Froud and you know, animated movies like Disney movies and stuff like that. He could see that I was not looking at Boris and Frazetta and Hildebrand, like, or the staff that they had of great artists. And my reasoning was that I can't do what they draw. Like, I can't do that as well as they can. So why would I even try? So what he told me later was, though, this, and then no bright color. It's all earth. Everything's brown, with shades of brown and moss and dirt and rust.
All these muted tones, like
all the muted. Yes. Again, Brian Froud, Arthur Rackham. Like, I'm looking at all that stuff. But he told me later that there was quite a division in the staff that didn't care for my art because it was so radically of such a radical departure from the stuff they were used to using. And, you know, I love Jeff Easley's art, as evidenced by the Jeff Easley hanging on the wall behind me. But Jeff is like, there's bravado, there's testosterone, they're strong, they're able. Mine were emaciated. They were all Gollum, you know. I mean, they were all really. So, you know, the thing was, in my mind, the world was big enough for both.
Right.
You should, just like in the real world, you know, there's skinny people, there's physically fit people, there's overweight people, and so I felt like the game should somehow reflect that human imagery that I saw all the time in the world around me.
Well, I think, though, I mean, you mentioned it was a radical departure, but I think what's interesting is it's all fantasy, but it's a different realm of fantasy. And I found that interesting when looking through Planescape in particular. I was like, okay, this is coming from, like you mentioned, Brian Froud. That's the stuff that I was like, okay, this other area of fantasy that I'm into, but I'm not seeing in gaming. I thought that was interesting, but I could see how that would be somewhat divisive amongst people who are saying, well, where are the loincloths? Where are the giant bulging muscles? A hero's got to be strapping. And there's nothing wrong with that. I like strapping. Give me a good loincloth any day. I'm down with it.
Exactly.
Sword sandals, I love. But there are other ways to express this kind of magical world. How did all that become Planescape? Because Planescape was building off of the art that Dana Knutson did.
That's correct.
So so how did that all start to come together then?
So Zeb Cook, who was I don't know, he must have been the lead designer on Planescape, because there were certainly other people on the team, but he was the lead on it. At least that was my perception when I came on board. Mm-hmm. And Dana was a staff artist and began to work with Zeb as Zeb started to assemble inspiration. He had two artists in particular Zeb was really into that are key components to Planescape. One was Yoshitaka Amano, who was the illustrator who concepted all the Final Fantasy games, which were, I don't know what they were on in 93 or Final Fantasy 2, maybe. You know, I mean, you had the game in heart. To my mind, hadn't been. You were playing on like a Sega Genesis.
Right.
So Yoshitaka Amano, and he had a couple of Amano's books from Japan. They were all in Japanese, so we couldn't read them, but I'd never seen his art before and was floored by how beautiful it was. And I can never remember his first name, but his last name is Piranesi, and Piranesi was an Italian artist in the 17th century who drew ruins. He went to all the classic ruins and did these drawings of them in great detail. But the one book that Piranesi did that, and I'm going to grab it for you. You see my sweatpants? I dressed up for you, bro.
I appreciate that.
The one book that Zeb loved was Piranesi's Carceri, the prisons. These were fantastic prisons that he designed, which end up becoming the inspiration for many of the settings in Planescape. I mean, some of the illustrations I did are copied right out of this book.
Right.
So this was one of the core books, because the thing, if you can look, it's on an epic scale. The people are tiny in these illustrations. And so the idea of this architecture being such a critical component to the world was really, I thought was really exciting about it. It was my understanding from Peggy that Dana was working with him in a conceptual way, like an in-house concept artist. So Dana did a bunch of concept work, and then they sent some of that work along with a bunch of copies from the Yoshitaka Amano and the Carceri book to me, and asked me to do some samples. So I had to audition for it, and I still have those pieces of art. I did 2 pieces of art for it to audition. I had to draw a building, and I had to draw a player character.
Right.
And I did them, and they were like, "You're our guy." And I said, "Oh, great. Who else is going to be working on this?" "Just you." And I'm like, "What?" You know, and they're like, "Well, what about Dana?" And they're like, "Dana's going to do the covers along with Rob Ruppel, but the interiors are just going to be you. We want, at least for the campaign," here's how it happened. For the campaign setting, we wanted to have a unified look like what Brahm did for Dark Sun.
Right.
So we're going to have you do the campaign setting, all the interior art for it. And we know you can handle it because you did it in Dragon Mountain, and we see you've gotten a little better since then. So we know you're our person for it. So I was like, okay. So again, kind of a mixture of excitement and definitely being nervous and scared, because there was a lot on the line.
You know, Dana, I've talked to Dana before, and he told me that the marching orders he got, especially for the buildings, was make this world spiky and bumpy.
That's it, spiky, bumpy.
So for you, besides getting, you know, some of Dana's stuff and the books that they sent you and things, did you have marching orders going into this in terms of the tone, in terms of how they wanted you to approach this thing? But also in terms of the artwork itself, your technique in it, because the technique's very different too. You had the airbrush stuff going on, you had all the pen and ink work. So what kind of conversations were you having on an an artistic level?
Yeah, well, I do remember sitting in a conference. They flew me up, and I remember sitting in a conference room, and we talked about the campaign book and the first Monster Command. I think those were the first 2 things to come out. And we talked about if there were ways we could do something visually different. So I got the spiky bumpy memo. I also got make everything look, it wasn't ancient, but like time worn. We want everything to feel like it's been here for eons. That's why the armor's all rusty and the clothes are all dirty. Like, it's like this existence these things have been here since, you know, time infinite. And then one thing I do remember was we talked about the monster book, and I lamented that, you know, you had these cool monsters, these iconic Dungeons and Dragons monsters, and in the Monstrous Manual, you know, they're in this tiny little index card sized box, and I'm like, you can't constrain the Tarrasque. You can't put an owlbear in a little tiny box. You know, they don't want to stand for that. I want them ripping across the pages. I want them interacting with the text. And I remember literally just like holding the book up and kind of showing it. And at the time, Dawn Murin was the designer. She was the graphic designer for this stuff.
Yeah.
And Dawn said, you know, I think with Quark or whatever she was using to lay the stuff out, she's like, I think we could actually wrap the text around the art now in a more organic way. And everyone was like, really? You can do that? And she's like, yeah, but what I need is no backgrounds. I need, going back to the backgrounds, I need you to draw the stuff in a way that keeps it almost floating, like a vignette. Everything needs to be like a vignette.
Yeah.
And if it's a vignette, then we can do two things. We can move it anywhere on the page, and we can shrink it, and it's still an organic shape. It's not bound by a box.
Right.
That way, we'll have this modular freedom to move the pieces around to get the layout the way we like. So that's why I use the airbrush a lot, because it was a quick way to make the color just kind of gradiate into white.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? I mean, we do it with a gradient now on the computer, but back then it was an airbrush. So even if I had to do a spot with a background, the solution was paint it and then make it look like a torn piece of paper that's been ripped out of a book or something. And then airbrush a little drop. We would hand airbrush the drop shadow, spray the back of the illustration would be done, and then I would tear the paper, spray it with Super 77 adhesive, smack it on this drop shadow on a piece of illustration board, and that would be the art. I mean, we do it so differently now, but
are there any particular characters that you created or that you drew in Planescape that stand out for you as being particularly fun, or have any particular stories behind them? I mean, certainly people think of the tiefling, they think of gnomes with all sorts of, you know, the little candle on the hats and things like that. But are there any for you that are your kind of fond memory pieces?
So I'm working on it, getting my feet wet, and Zeb calls one day and he goes, hey, do you know what the Modrons are? And I said, those weird geometric people, you know, in the second monster or Fiendful, I couldn't even remember which thing they were. And he goes, yeah. I go, I mean, yeah. I'm like not excited. He goes, before you say anything, I want you to read the lore of the Modrons, because we're thinking about putting them in Planescape as a really central, you know, character or race in the entire world of Planescape. And I'm like, okay, so I didn't have, I think it's Monstrous Manual 2 is what they're in. I didn't have it. So he like faxes it. The pages are coming out of the thermal paper's unrolling, you know, and I rip it off and I'm reading and I'm like, oh, he's right. This is really, really interesting. It's really cool. This lore of these monodrones who become duodrones, and like they work their way up, and there's always a set number, and they diminish as they become more powerful till they become Primus. It was really, really fascinating. And Zeb said they're going to live on a plane called Mechanus, and immediately my brain went to the Wizard of Oz for some reason, and I thought of not the Tin Man, but I thought of TikTok, who's in Ozma of Oz and was in the not that old movie at the time called Return to Oz, which I loved.
So that's what you were going to when you were thinking about the Modrons.
All of Planescape made me think of Oz. Like it was such a bizarro world. And so I thought of TikTok. And so I used TikTok as the inspiration. I sent Zeb one sketch. I did one monodrone, sketched it out, faxed it back to him. And he said, we're doing Modrons. I want you to design all the Modrons, you know, we're putting Modrons in. And I was delighted about, I mean, that was it. I was like, okay, good. That's cool. Like, and you just moved on. And then to open up 5th edition, and there's your Modron design. Is first of all, Modrons are still in D&D as like a central thing now. And like, oh my God, it's still your design. Like they're still using the design you did back in '93. It's pretty crazy when you think about it. The tieflings were a little different than how tieflings are depicted currently. I mean,
Yeah.
now I think there's a shorthand for tieflings, like put horns on them and maybe make their skin red, and that's a tiefling. But then the thinking was that the fiendish bloodline, and for those who are not sure what a tiefling
Right.
is, it's the offspring of someone who has fiend in the bloodline somewhere
Right.
up the line.
So
though.
some demonic DNA has made it through
Right.
to the character, to the creature,
Yes.
the person.
Yes, but you're not the direct offspring. So
Right.
there may be like succubus in your blood or incubus in your blood, but you are not the offspring.
Right. You're like the great something child
right.
of Joe
And
the
it will
incubus.
and so there was a great list of, and it's probably in the campaign
Yeah.
box, I haven't looked in a while, of all the physical manifestations of that, which were cool. You'd have just scaly skin.
Yep.
You would have one cloven hoof. You'd have bat wings, but they wouldn't be full. They'd be little tiny bat
Right.
wings. You'd have a horn or two horns, or you'd have a vestigial tail, or you'd have red skin, or you'd be hairless. There was like all these weird things. And here's the thing that I loved that they should bring back is androgyny. And so Colin McComb was a big advocate for this, because Colin and I had a shared love of The Cure, the band The Cure,
Yep.
and Robert Smith and David Bowie, and all these gender bending icons. And he thought that the tieflings would also embrace that, what we now call like a gender fluidity. Back then we just called androgynous or gender bender.
Yeah.
And it was, and so if you look at, especially in a lot of the later books, we drew men in dresses and skirts,
Yeah.
and females that were maybe female, but I'm not quite sure now, when, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not, and I loved all that. I felt like it was like the sky was the limit with the tieflings. The other thing, so that was one thing with the tieflings. The other big one was that they were often very alluring, titillating,
Right.
and charismatic, which in my brain led to, there's a lot of cleavage and stuff. Like, I didn't quite know how else to show that. So I would get these Fredericks of Hollywood catalogs in the mail, these little catalogs. And they would literally, I knew no women who looked like that. So I would draw if I had to draw a succubus or the Irenes or some of these other ones, I would just I'd flip through and go, okay, that's the girl, and I'm going to draw her. And that's why they all look like they're wearing like undergarments, because they were in the reference photos.
Oh, man.
They're just women in their underwear. So the tieflings ran this gamut of kind of, like you said, like the fur bikinis and the version of that, all the way to what we now call gender fluid characters that happen to have a tail or cloven hooves.
Right.
And it was great fun drawing them. And again, had no idea that we were creating a race that you could play that is still played to this day.
Okay, so Tony, 5 favorite D&D monsters, whether it's stuff you drew yourself, whether it's from others, classics, new ones, 5 favorites.
Right. Well, okay, this be hard to keep it down to 5, I think, for me.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think I know Dave Trampier's illustration of the fire giant in the first Monster Manual is so epic, man. That I remember drawing that when I was 12 years old. It's just such a incredible illustration. It's so well designed. And when you get is it Against the Giants, the module, and they printed the art really big. Oh my god, I loved that as a kid. Also, obviously, I would lump in the Chinosaurs, if you want to call them that, but the Boule, the Owl Bear, and the Rust Monster, that were all inspired by the plastic toys. And those were all drawn by Dave Sutherland, I believe, in the first Monster Manual as well. And those, to me, are like quintessential Dungeons and Dragons monsters, because they're so weird.
Yeah.
They're such a part of Dungeons and Dragons, and though you see things like owlbears exist in other games, that is where they were born. And the idea that the game is now starting to spawn its own folklore,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word, is so amazing to me, because so much of it was borrowed from Tolkien and old Celtic folklore and sci-fi things. So
I mean, you can't go wrong with owlbears. I mean, I wear my owlbear appreciation hat
that's
with
right. That's right.
the Sutherland classic
Owlbear, yes,
from
and of course got my tiny plastic owlbear there. Yep. Let me see. I also love, for some reason, when I was younger, and I still have this. This has been a D&D monster that I've adored since I was a kid, and had the opportunity to illustrate and still draw for my own pleasure today, which is the kobold. I love the original kobold illustration in the first Monster Manual.
Yeah.
I remember buying miniatures of the little grenadier kobolds.
Yep.
I got to illustrate the kobold in the Monstrous Manual, and I still draw them to this day for myself. I've drawn many kobolds. In fact, when we did the big collection of realms, I did a really fancy, realistic painting of a kobold.
Well, you brought them back to that kind of, lately kobolds have been shifting more and more into like little mini dragons, but you were going back to that old style of kobold where they were a little more canine and a little more kind of not necessarily straight up just tiny dragons, tiny pissed off lizards.
Yeah, no, the original descriptions definitely describe them as dog-like.
Yeah.
They smell dog-like. They love wearing the color red and orange for whatever reason. And when you look at,
I forgot about that part.
Like they're like picking up trash on the side of the road or something. Don't hit them.
Right.
But they, I would guess that the original Dave Sutherland illustration, it almost looks like a gargoyle, which I'm wondering if that's maybe what he looked at for inspiration. It's got that kind of gargoyle type head. And I did a real stretched out skinny version in the Monstrous Manual, but the thing that I came up with was the stick with the scorpion on the end of it. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, dude, when you saw the stick with the scorpion, we were like, we have used that so many times, where they put it down the like plate mail, like it goes down the back of the plate mail, and it, the knight can't get it out, and the scorpion's just,
well, it's still there. Like in 5th edition, Chris Seaman, an artist named Chris Seaman, who I love, he did in one of the expansion books for 5th edition, it might have been Volo's Guide to Monsters. They did sort of new classes of kobolds, and one of them he illustrated, and it's like the kobold, forget if it's like the scavenger or whatever, and he drew him holding the staff with the scorpion on the end. So it's still alive and well, man. The stuff that was created is still carrying forward today.
That's crazy.
Which is pretty awesome.
That's the thing, Brian, that I geek out on. I'm not nostalgic for it because I was creating it at the time. Right. I'm nostalgic for Sutherland and Trampier and Otis and stuff I was a kid. But it's amazing to see that the stuff that I was creating has become, definitely part of the lore.
Well, it becomes part of the canon, the same way. That's it. The same way, like stuff that Sutherland did, or the same way that some stuff like Larry or Larry Elmore, Jeff Easley did, these sort of classic artists that we all grew up on. This stuff all gets folded. When I talk to people about D&D art, I note that it's a continuity. It's not, a lot of people like to say, oh, this was my favorite era and all art after that sucked, or this is my favorite era, how did people like that old art? And I'm like, you don't understand. It's all building on everything else. Yeah. Anyone who loves this art can look back on early stuff that maybe is before their time and see, oh, there are things in there that I really like, and I can see where it comes into play later. Or they can say, okay, I can see where these newer artists are coming in and what they're doing. Oh yeah, I can see how they're building upon the stuff that came before it. And I think it's that continuity that makes D&D art so fun and fascinating and interesting to kind of dig into.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
If you could have a D&D monster or character or something from the modules, however you want to approach this, as a buddy, as someone to hang out with.
Oh,
You know,
I've got one. I mean, it's. I've got my kobold.
your kobold.
There's my kobold.
Awesome.
There he is.
Awesome.
Hey, buddy.
Needs
Your
the
kobold?
staff with the scorpion.
He gets into just as much trouble,
Oh.
and you know, sometimes loyal, not always. Right? He's looking at the owlbear. He wants to chew that up. No, buddy. If it costs more than you did, you can't have it as a toy.
But that is the loyalty you'd want from a companion, someone who will take out that owlbear, who will attack that owlbear for you against all the odds. They'll face that claw bite.
Yes, the hug.
Oh. So last question, Tony, what is it that was so much fun about working on Dungeons and Dragons? What did you love so much about working in that world?
You know, I met some amazing people. I made some friends that I'm, you know, as I said, I'm still in touch with. And as you know, the Norman Rockwell Museum a few years back did a retrospective of my art, where Dungeons and Dragons art got to hang in a museum, which was amazing. And it was very meaningful to me to be able to share that with Zeb Cook and Dawn Murin and Dana Knutson and Colin McComb, all of whom were people I met while working at TSR and who I've remained friendly and in touch with ever since. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, the years that I worked on Planescape and for Dungeons and Dragons, I learned so much about world building, and it was so impactful on the books that I've created for young readers, especially with the Spiderwick Chronicles. Holly Black is a huge Dungeons and Dragons fan as well, and I'm delighted to see that it has reached popularity beyond anything anybody could have ever imagined. So I think that's just to be a part of that, and to have helped it be, you know, sustain and become what it is something I'm very proud of.
Tony DiTerlizzi, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again in real life.
Yes, that sounds good. Be safe, be healthy, be well.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching Into the Ultra. I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you want to see more, please subscribe. We drop new episodes every Tuesday. You can also check out some of my other projects. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I made a movie called Plastic Galaxy, the story of Star Wars toys, and I co-produced and co-directed a documentary called Eye of the Beholder, the Art of Dungeons and Dragons. Both are available on Amazon Prime and iTunes and a host of other streaming services. And if you want to follow along with my newest project, I co-produced it with Cave Girl Productions. It's called Igniting the Spark, the Story of Magic the Gathering, and I posted a link to that down in the description. Thank you very much. I hope to see you next Tuesday.